At around 6:49 a.m. on the 22nd of May 1915, a fully loaded troop train was passing close to Gretna Green in Scotland. The train was bound for Liverpool, where its passengers, mostly soldiers of the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots, would be loaded onto ships and sent onwards to Gallipoli, where they expected to encounter challenging conditions and fierce fighting against Ottoman forces. Little did the men on board realise, however, that the vast majority of them would never make it beyond Gretna Green. The train on which they travelled was about to become part of one of the worst rail disasters of all time. The declaration of war in 1914 made the movement of freight and troops of paramount importance to Britain. So vital were the railways, indeed, that the government immediately seized control of most of them and pressed into service every car they could get their hands on, including old rolling stock that had been given up for scrap in previous years. New wagons were built quickly and cheaply to keep Britain moving. The flow of these wagons and the engines which pulled them was controlled by signalmen in signal boxes situated at every vital junction and crossing. By pulling levers, these men could switch points to direct trains from one track to another and activate signals which would instruct trains to proceed, wait in a siding, or reverse as necessary. The signal box closest to Gretna Green was the Quintinshill signal box. Although usually manned by only a single signalman, there were actually two present at the time of the disaster. George Meakin was the night signalman. After being relieved by his day shift colleague, James Tinsley, he hung around in the box reading a newspaper while Tinsley set himself up for the day. This handover also happened later than was scheduled. Technically, Meakin should have handed over to Tinsley at 6 a.m, but there was an informal agreement in place between day and night signalmen, whereby the night signalman on duty would often work up to half an hour late, so that the day signalman that would relieve them wouldn't have to get up so early. Thus, it was actually 6:30 a.m. when Tinsley arrived and took control of the box. This half-hour difference seemed of little consequence to the signalmen themselves, but it would be one contributing factor in what happened next. Tinsley would be controlling a relatively simple section of track. It consisted of two lines, one running towards Carlisle, which was referred to as the up line, and one running towards Glasgow, which was referred to as the down line. Each of these lines also had a siding. This would allow slow trains to pull off the main track and allow faster express trains to bypass them and get underway. It was also possible to move trains between the up line and the down line using a connecting section of track. At the time of the disaster, the siding on the down line was occupied by a parked goods train. A local train on the down line needed to move aside so that an express train could get by. Night signalman Meakin was well aware that it couldn't pull into the occupied siding, and so instead he had it reverse from the down line onto the up line. This freed up the down line and let the express train get past, but left that local train parked on the up line. A train consisting of empty coal wagons was waiting to use that up line. Meakin, still in control of the situation, sent that train into the siding and ordered it to wait there. It was at this point that Tinsley took control of the box and ushered through one express train that was waiting on the down line. As the down line was clear, this train passed through without incident. Then, seemingly forgetting about the local train parked on the up line, Tinsley signalled to a troop train waiting to pass through the up line that it was clear to proceed. This moment of absent-mindedness is all the more alarming given that Tinsley arrived for his shift that day riding on board that local train. He had only hopped off the engine minutes before. Now, its presence completely slipped his mind. The troop train surged along the upline and, with a thunderous crash, smashed into the local train, sending several of its cars spilling from the track. Many were injured and killed by this collision, but the situation was still to worsen. Another express train was already inbound on the down line. It was too late for the signalman to stop it. The express train entered the down line, ploughed into the scattered wreckage, and itself derailed. Now there were 3 trains smashed together and scattered across the tracks. Dozens of people lay dead, some of them hit by the express train after having evacuated the troop train and local train. Many more were injured or trapped in the wreckage, but still, the worst was yet to come. The rickety troop train, pressed into service specifically for the war effort, was built from cheap wood and lit by gas-powered lanterns. These swiftly started a fire, which swept hungrily through the wreckage, consuming those who had survived the collision. Rescuers worked frantically to free their friends and fellow soldiers from the wreck, but in many cases it was simply impossible. There wasn't time to do so before the smoke and flames reached them. There are many stories of impromptu amputations that were carried out on the spot to free trapped soldiers. Witnesses also report that, where rescue was impossible and flames were approaching, officers shot their own men in order to spare them the pain of burning alive. Doctors and firefighters from Gretna Green soon arrived at the site of the collision. They were met with an apocalyptic scene of death and destruction. Over 200 people had died in the space of mere minutes, and the fires which burned through the wreckage raged for an entire day. Every single wagon, apart from 6 which had detached at the moment of collision and rolled back along the track, was entirely consumed, and every ounce of coal on board the train was burned up by the flames. The vast majority of casualties were from those on board the troop train. 226 people died in the collision, and 215 of them were soldiers. These numbers are, it should be noted, approximate. The fire was so intense that some bodies could not be identified, and some were entirely cremated by the flames. Taking into account both deaths and injuries, the 7th Battalion was left utterly devastated. Approximately half of the entire unit had been on board the train, 498 soldiers. Only 62 of those arrived in Liverpool unscathed. Given the trauma that they had endured and the depletion in their numbers, the men were sent straight back to Edinburgh, with only a handful of ranking officers required to board a ship and sail for the front. Most of the dead had come from the town of Leith. It was said that there was not a single household in that community who did not know at least one of the dead. This emotional shock was no doubt compounded by the fact that so few bodies could be positively identified. The majority of the dead was simply too badly burned. A funeral procession through Leith carried the bodies to their final resting place, Rosebank Cemetery. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lined the route in order to pay their respects to the dead, who were then interred in a mass grave. Even as the bodies were being buried, an investigation was launched. Its findings were decisive. The fault lay with the 2 signalmen, Meakin and Tinsley. They came under fire for the unofficial tweaks they had made to their shift schedule. It was perfectly common for the night signalman on duty to work half an hour late to save the day signalman from getting up too early, but it certainly wasn't officially allowed. To avoid getting into trouble, Meakin wrote down his notes for the extra half hour he worked on a piece of scrap paper, so that Tinsley, when he eventually did arrive, could copy them out into the logbook in his own handwriting, making it seem as though he'd arrived at exactly the right time. Thus, when Tinsley should have been concentrating on the complex situation on the train lines, he was actually more focused on updating the logbook to ensure that he didn't get into trouble for sleeping late. This distraction might have contributed to him forgetting the presence of a train on the upline, the most egregious error which contributed to the disaster. But Tinsley alone wasn't to blame. During his shift, Meakin had also neglected to place a safety collar on one of the signals. The collar would have physically prevented Tinsley from giving an incorrect signal. The two men were found guilty of culpable manslaughter. Meakin was sentenced to 18 months in prison, while Tinsley was given 3 years with hard labour. Both prisoners were, however, released after just 1 year, a sentence which might seem shockingly light by today's standards. However, this accident occurred during wartime, when every available man was needed to serve king and country. The death of more than 200 soldiers in a terrible accident was more forgivable in a context where thousands were slaughtered each and every day in the trenches. Indeed, after their release from prison, both men were re-employed to work on the railways, and went on to have long and relatively successful careers. Meanwhile, a memorial was raised to the dead by public subscription. It stands to this day in Rosebank Cemetery in Leith. Upon it are listed the names of the dead, those men who, despite being brave enough to fight for their country, died before even reaching the battleground.